All right. So now here we are. The Torah reading is, hold on a second. The Torah reading is Balak, and it begins on page 894 in our Eitz Chaim Chumash. It's Numbers chapter 22, and it begins with verse 2. Okay, not from verse 1, but from verse 2. And
Rabbi, why is that the case?
So the answer is that the divisions that we use in our Torah are very ancient. We have them already in certain divisions, are already marked, not marked, but are apparent in the Torah scroll. So for instance, we have spaces. We know where each of the 5 books begins and ends. And then we have parshiot. We call it parsha, like the parsha of the week, but a parsha is actually just one separate section. So separate sections are also indicated in the Torah. When you write a Sefer Torah, you can't just write it any way you want, and you can't just write, whatever paragraphs or sentences, or if you want to, space things out a certain way, you can't do that. So the sections are already dictated by our tradition. We never had chapters with verse numbers of chapters. We only had parshiot. We only had these sections. So you will never find, for instance, in Rashi never says, oh, just like it says in Bereshit chapter 5, verse 2. He'll never say that. He'll say, look at the parsha, of Kitavo, or look at the parsha of Im Kesef Talvet Ami, which is a section within Mishpatim. He does so. All of the commentators, all of the Jewish tradition refers to sections in that way. Chapters and verses, like verses, we have verses, but we never numbered the verses. The numbers of verses come from the chapters. Once we divided things into chapters, then we said, okay, if this is the beginning of a chapter, here's verse 1, verse 2, verse 3. Who did that? The church. The church divided up the quote unquote Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Once they had a New Testament and an Old Testament, they divided everything up into chapters and verses. And that became universal, just like we say that this year is 2021. We got that from the church. So
is it okay to think that's convenient? Actually, don't mind that you have chapters and verses.
So again, I mean, we functioned for over 1,000 years after the destruction of the temple. I would say good 1,500 years without worrying about chapters and verses. We did pretty good, but nobody is objecting. Here it is. Here's our Eitz Chaim Chumash. We've got chapters and verses. Noted, except that they don't always work with the way our tradition divides up things. Every once in a while, it's less. I mean, that's very common, but every once in a while, we don't even have the same verse divisions. So sometimes we count the verses a certain way, and Christian Bibles count the verses other ways. So in scholarly literature, every once in a while, you'll see references, and it'll be in 2 different ways of referring to a verse number because of different ways of looking at things. It happens in Psalms a bunch of times, but it happens here and there. It's one of the things that is up for grabs is the 10 Commandments. How do you actually divide up the 10 Commandments? So Judge, remember what's his name? Morse. What's the guy? What's the disgusting guy down in Georgia or wherever he is? He says, let's put the 10 Commandments up on the, everybody agrees about the thing. The point is, no, not everybody agrees about how you count even the 10 Commandments. So different traditions have chopped up the text in different ways. And we have gone along with that very common way of doing it. But here and there, like right now, we see that they don't always line up.
Rabbi, we've chopped up different things. For example, occasionally a Haftorah will say, for the Sephardic version, see this page instead of the regular page that we're looking at.
Yeah, but that's not that's choices of texts, but it's not labeling the chapters and the verses differently.
Correct.
So it's like choosing half of the text or even choosing a different text altogether. There are different traditions about what the Haftorah should be. But we all agree the Jewish tradition has no variations in whether this is verse 2 or verse 1 or verse 3 or whatever it is, or, we just don't, we don't have that stuff.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when this was going back in time, were the books given names? We've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and then after, Deuteronomy, we've got more
Right.
names for different things.
Right.
So
Right.
where did that come from?
So I don't know the whole history of when that happened. That's a good question. Again, the the names of the books as we have them now are late. They don't in rabbinic, for instance, in the Talmud or in Midrash, or even in early commentators, they don't always call the 5 books of Moses the names that we have them, that we usually use for them. They have, phrases that they use. So like Devarim is not usually called Devarim, it's called Mishnah Torah, something like that. So, or Vayikra is often not called Vayikra, it's called Torah's Kohanim, right? The Torah, the teaching of the priests, right? The word Leviticus is a little bit like that because Leviticus means having to do with the Levites, right? So, but we, often just have the names based on a word in the verse. So this Torah reading is called Balak. If we were like really, wanted to do some kind of title that had to do with the theme, we probably wouldn't choose Balak. We'd choose Bilam, because Bilam is the prophet whose words are the main subject, and his whole story of coming to put the whammy on Israel, but then being turned around by God. He's obviously he's invited by Balak. Balak is the king, but Balak is not the main guy. Nevertheless, he's the first unique word in the beginning of the Torah reading, so he gets to be the name of the Torah reading. So it's called Balak because it says Vayar Balak ben Tzipor, and Balak, the son of Tzipor, saw. So Balak gets the honor of being called the name of this section.
Although I would think a prophet is higher than a king.
Tell that to Balak. But wear a neck protector when you do that. Wear and a bulletproof vest or something like that.
Actually, I have one.
Yeah, there you go. All right. So our Torah reading is Balak. So if you don't have the Eitz Chaim, as I said, it's chapter 22 in the book of Numbers. There's a name that's not used at all in Jewish tradition. Sometimes it's called Chumash HaPekudim, the Chumash, the section of the 5 books of Moses that has the accountings of all the people. But nobody calls it Misparim or even Pekudim. They call it Bamidbar, right? So, which is again the word that is one of the first words in the verse. So, for those who have a different edition, chapter 22 of Numbers, verse 2 is where we begin, and this we've had back and forth, as I've said as we've gone through this book. Narrative law. This Torah reading is all narrative, right? Through and through. It's all story, and it's got, it's story with some very poetic, utterances embedded in the story, some real poetry going on. The main story is the story of Balak inviting this prophet Bilam from far away, from Mesopotamia, to come all the way to Moab on the banks of the Jordan to curse out this people who he detests quite intensely, so that he can defeat them. And we have the whole back and forth whether Bilam can go or not go. He finally goes. We have the sub-story within the story of the talking ass that sort of puts him a little bit in his place. He's supposed to be the most famous, world famous celebrity prophet. And then he, his donkey can see better than him. What's going on, can see an angel of God. So we have that little satirical story within the story. He finally arrives. And again and again and again, Balak hopes that he's going to curse the children of Israel, and he doesn't. And he keeps explaining to Balak, I told you, I can only say what God wants me to say. I'm not an independent operator. I'm at God's disposal. So Balak tries once, Balak tries twice, after 3 times where Bilam, instead of cursing Israel, blesses Israel, Balak throws up his hands literally and goes, I've had it, get out of here. You're lucky that you're leaving here alive. You completely, I was going to honor you and bestow all kinds of rewards upon you. You're lucky to just get out of here. So that happens. And that takes us to chapter 25, and that's the last. And so Bilam goes home, and Balak goes back to his place. And then chapter 25, there's a short little section here of 9 verses that gives us another story linked to this past story in a kind of like a, on the other hand, after all of these blessings to Israel, we have a picture of Israel being totally unfaithful to God and engaging in idolatrous practices. And God gets very, very angry. And there's a vigilante act on the part of one of the Jewish leaders, Pinchas, to put a stop to this whole terrible phenomenon. And he kills a couple, an Israelite chieftain and his Midianite princess paramour. He kills them in the middle of their copulation in front of the tent of meeting, and that stops the plague, and that's the end of the Torah. So that's it. What do you want? What's everybody's pleasure for today?
I don't know which one I want, but I find it interesting. It sounds like Bilam was the real thing. He's the real deal. If he's actually, and especially admitting that I can only say what God wants me to.
Yeah, I mean, Bilam is a character of great interest over the years. How do we evaluate Bilam? How well does he come off, or how badly does he come off? What do we do with the fact that he really is in communication with God? I mean, God, talks to him, and God puts words in his mouth. How do we handle all of that? So that's an ongoing subject of discussion and exploration. And we actually have Bilam mentioned in archaeological finds. There is a guy named Bilam. I don't remember if we have it here mentioned in the. It may have come out actually after the Eitz Chaim was published. But we have some reference to Bilam in ancient Near Eastern archaeological finds. So somebody out there had a name like that. I don't remember all of what the evidence was that was discovered, but I think that it was about somebody, who was of some prominence. So do we look at that story again? Do we look at the Bilam story? All right.
I would say yes, but what about not starting at the beginning? Because we always seem to start at the beginning.
Yeah.
So there's,
We're not starting at the beginning. We're starting at verse 2.
right.
Did you miss that part when we were discussing that?
No, I was here.
Yeah. Okay.
Like starting with chapter 24, maybe, where he's already gotten Balak.
How about so let's compromise, right? Let's start with chapter 22, verse 40. Okay. Page 899 in the Eitz Chaim. This is after his arrival. Okay. And you know what? Let's start from verse 38.
Oh, now you're moving it back.
I know. I'm sorry. I can't resist.
I know.
Or 37. How about let's start 36. Come on, it's like those, Japanese omelets. You just want more and more. You want to just roll it together and roll them all. So let's start 899, the top of the page. At least I'm not going to a different page. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. Thank you for your patience. So you know what? How about it? You've got it.
Okay. When Balak heard that Balaam was coming, he went out to meet him at Ir Moab, which is on the Arnon border at its furthest point. Balak said to Balaam, when I first sent to invite you, why didn't you come to me? Am I really unable to reward you? But Balaam said to Balak, and now that I have come to you, have I the power to speak freely? I can utter only the word that God puts into my mouth.
Right. So that's why I wanted us to start over
Yeah.
here, because it really, puts front and center that before, Bilam really starts doing anything, he's already, again, not just through messengers and through this back and forth that we, have at the beginning of the Torah reading. Here he is face to face with Balak. Balak is showing him extraordinary honor. If you see in the notes, for instance, the fact that he went out and goes all the way to the north to meet Bilam on his very, very long journey. He finally comes into Moab territory, and the king comes out to greet him. And the king has this, hey, excuse me, why I'm treating you with so much honor? Don't you think that I can, shouldn't you honor me as well? And Bilam right there at the beginning says, hey, I can't help it. It's really up to God. Yeah, Jen.
I know we use a lot of different words for names for God in the Torah, or words for God in the Torah. Can we tell, like in our tradition, do we think that Bilam actually recognizes Hashem as the Israelites know Hashem, or is he kind of more like all the gods are one? Like, do we have any idea? Is he using some kind of generic term, or is he actually recognizing the God of Israel?
So it's some, as we go through the rest of the text, we'll maybe pay attention. Let's notice what kind of names are used. Some of the scholars, Robert Alter, I was just looking at Robert Alter before. Robert Alter makes a point that there's a little bit of an ambiguity, or the way he wants to read it. Some people say, look, he's not really completely on board with Israelite beliefs, but the way he wants to read it is that he's being a very good interfaith participant. When we participate with mostly Christian groups and Christian religious leaders, in our neck of the woods, there's always the question of how are the religious leaders, the prayers, going to refer to God? Because there's a very, very strong mitzvah almost in many Christian traditions. You need to say Jesus by name. You need to proclaim, Jesus' kingship and Jesus' godship, and say Jesus' name. So of course, once you have Jews in the room, that becomes a little insensitive. So those that want to be sensitive go out of their way to not do that kind of stuff. And it's been my privilege over all these years to participate not only in Montclair but also in Nutley, because we have the Nutley Jewish congregation. Was that what it was called? Nutley Hebrew congregation? What was it? I should know this. Geraldine, what was it called?
It was called Temple B'nai Israel, but it
There
was,
you go. Yeah.
but it's the Nutley Hebrew congregation.
Right. So which merged with Shomrei years ago. And therefore, every once in a while, I go over to Nutley to participate in some communal interfaith gathering, Thanksgiving, and my best fun time is when I participate when they do the lighting of 8 trillion zillion Christmas lights and a Hanukkah light also. But it's great.
But you are officially, according to our request from our congregation when we went over to Shomrei, you are officially our representative of the Jewish people from Nutley. So if anybody, any of the commissioners or political people have any questions, they're to go to you.
Right. No, I appreciate that. And yeah, I'm part of the Nutley Clergy Association and everything. So anyway, there's a long introduction to the fact that Nutley is much less a place of Jewish presence than Montclair. Montclair, by now Nutley has sadly no synagogues. Montclair has 2 thriving synagogues, and then 2 inches over the border we have many up to other synagogues. There's relatively speaking a robust Jewish presence in Montclair. Sometimes people are sensitive to that. Every once in a while they're not. But it's been wonderful. All of this, what I'm trying to say is, it's been wonderful to see over the years how the Nutley clergy have evolved in their own awareness of how they have to make room for other religious traditions. Even if they really don't see a substantial number of people sitting in the pews for a Thanksgiving service or something like that, they really have made literally a good faith effort to make their prayer language much more accommodating to everybody. And they're beginning to start thinking about Muslim traditions as well. So they're really on a learning curve, which is great. And like I say, they're really trying to do the right thing. So some people see Bilam as, even though he's talking acceptable Jewish God language, but he's using some of the stuff that could still play well for somebody like Balak.
So like Pharaoh did with Joseph, like
something like that. So, but in order to see that play out, we're going to have to pay more attention to some of the text. Here, the word that he uses, the name that he uses for God is a more generic word. It's not the tetragrammaton. It's not the 4-letter name of God, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, but it is Elohim. It's the Almighty, which is a more generic type of name for God. But nevertheless, he's saying it up front, I am God's tool. I am God's, vehicle. It's not really me. Which,
But Rabbi, isn't that
wait,
like
wait,
the
wait,
tradition-
one second. Let me just finish one more thing and then back to you. So Jen mentioned Joseph and Pharaoh. Joseph says something very similar when he stands in front of Pharaoh. And he says, it's not me who's going to interpret these dreams of yours, Pharaoh. It's God who's going to give, who's talking to you. And he uses that kind of language when he tries to get out of the sticky situation with Potiphar's wife. He says, I can't do this because I will be sinning against Elohim. I will not be able to, to transgress what the Almighty God wants. Yeah, Marty.
Isn't it by definition, by definition, it's not a prophet God's tool?
Yeah, but does he admit it? I
But
mean,
doesn't the Holy One speak through the prophet?
well, but that's the question here. Balak doesn't know that he's, Balak doesn't believe in God. Balak thinks that Bilam has some kind of connection with whatever
The mystical power?
whatever mystical or demonic or godly powers there are out there. He doesn't care where, Bilam gets the power. He just knows that he tells him, at the beginning of the story that we're skipping because we keep on doing this story all the time. So just kidding. But, he says, I know that's why I'm calling you. You're hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away, but your name is known far and wide. You've got the goods. You are this special power. You've got this gift. Whoever you curse is cursed. Whoever you bless is blessed. He doesn't say whoever God. I mean, that was my Torah for, in the thing. He sees this as you're a magical guy. So Bilam is a little bit disabusing him of this all the way at the beginning. Now, does he mean it? Does he really believe it wholeheartedly? This is part of the ambiguity, again, it's part of the story that we skipped, where, Bilam he gets a pretty clear message from God at the beginning. This is not for you, cut it out, this is bad. But he's really, really wants to do this, so come on. And then, he gets God to go along with it. So what we do with that, again, that's part of our question. But here, definitely, Bilam, his calling card or his public pronouncement to the monarch who's invited him is to say, hey, it ain't me, whatever God makes me do. Good. All right, 39.
Bilam went with Balak, and they came to Kiryat Huzot. Balak sacrificed oxen and sheep and had them served to Bilam and the dignitaries with him. In the morning, Balak took Bilam up to Bamot Baal. From there, he could see a portion of the people.
Okay, so if we read this again with paying attention to what our central question is, we should notice something about what happens here. What is Balak? Balak is now the host. What does Balak do? What's the beginning of this visitor's experience with Balak?
There's a sacrifice.
So who's running the show? Balak.
Balak.
Right, Balak is running the show. Like I say, he's the host. And do we think at all that Balak is a follower of God? Follower of the Israelite God? Of course not. And the giveaway is verse 41, right? He takes him to the high places of Baal. Baal is a Moabite god, a Canaanite god. It's the local name for Baal, master, right?
An idol.
It's a local god. It's a local deity that various peoples worship. So right after we have Bilam introducing himself and bringing in God, we've got Balak saying, yeah, I also believe in God. And now we're going to offer sacrifices the way I see the way you do these things. And now I'm going to bring you to this promontory, to this high place where you can see a little bit of this vast people that's, making me sick that there's so many of them in there and all of that kind of stuff. But he's taking him specifically to a place where he feels not just that it's, he's got a good perspective, he's got a good view of the landscape. This is a religiously identified place for all of the powers that Balak depends on. Okay, here we go.
Bilam said to Balak, "Build me 7 altars here and have 7 bulls and 7 rams ready here for me. Balak did as Bilam directed, and Balak and Bilam offered up a bull and a ram on each altar.
Okay, so let's connect this up with the previous verses. What we have here is a second sacrificial performance, right? We have a second set of sacrifices, and who's in charge this time?
Bilam.
Bilam.
Now Bilam is in charge, right? So he's answering, so to speak, Balak's setup first. And now he says, okay, now I'm in charge. Now you do it the way I want to do it. And we have the number 7 brought in here, right? A biblically significant number. So it's significant for Bilam as well. Let's have these 7 sacrifices. So whatever we did before, that's not sufficient. I need these sacrifices with these specially newly built altars to be done. And we have that reversal of power relations, right? And Balak did, how's it go? And Balak did as Bilam directed. That's a standard phrase. We have that all over the Torah. And Israel did as God directed. And Moses did as God directed. And Aaron did as God directed, right? So it's always about, there's the boss who gives the orders. And then if you're obedient, you're doing the right thing. So here we've got this very subtle but immediate shift in the power relation, right? Bilam has now taken hold of the reins.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
when Bilam takes control, is it still sacrifices to Baal?
It's ambiguous.
Well,
It doesn't- right?
It seems like it must be, because it's in this high place that is, the high place that is there for Baal, right?
Well, that's where I would argue that the ambiguity allows us to look at it the opposite way. That's part, I would say, the hint of that the 7 is a hint that he's saying, okay, now you've done your religious bit. I'm on a different religious wavelength, and the sacrifices that I need to do have to be to a different address and in a different form. And that's look at what he says. Look at the rest. Look at verse 3.
And Bilam said to Balak, "Stay here beside your offerings while I am gone. Perhaps the Lord will grant me a manifestation, and whatever he reveals to me, I will tell you." And he went off alone.
And what's the name of God that's used here?
Is that the Yod He Vav He? That's Hashem there?
Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, yeah.
Right. So now we've got all of a sudden popping out of his mouth a name that is absolutely unique to this religious tradition. So you could still be stubborn. You can argue and say no. So what he's doing is he's saying, Bilam, I want to keep you busy. So you go give these sacrifices to your God. I'll go off. I got to talk to my God, to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Let's see what God, or the more, I think the more probable answer is, I need these sacrifices to propitiate the God that I hope will then appear to me and give me what you want, right? So that's, the other way of saying it, where Bilam, on the one hand, he's there with God, the God of all eternity and being and the source of all life. But he does, like at the beginning of the story, the setup at the beginning of the story is, maybe I can wheedle God into, saying, letting me do some mischief here with these people. It's not like this people has gone through the last, remember, we're 40 years of wandering already. This is at the end of the 40 years. It's not like these people have a spotless record of piety or of military victory. So you never know.
Rabbi, what about the similarity between the name Balaam and the God's name Baal?
So
Does that
in Hebrew, it's not that
No,
similar.
it's Bilam.
It's in Hebrew, it's Bilam. So it's like Bilam, Bilam. And Baal is Baal, B-A-L, right? B-A-A-L. So there, it's spelled very differently, and it's except in in the English where it has where it says Balaam. In the Hebrew, nobody says Balaam. The vocalization in the Hebrew is Bilam. In general, I never understand why they do those things,
Yeah.
but they do it all over the place.
Etymology is weird.
This should be
What?
A.
Etymology is weird. How things.
It's not about if
But
you're
the
trying
wheel,
to
it should be
if you're trying to
spelled with an
present a
I.
translation. You're trying to present a translation of a text. Why not follow the pronunciation of that text? I don't get it. Anyway,
Yeah.
here we go.
Okay, so God manifested himself to Bilam, who said to him, I have set up the 7 altars and offered up a bull and a ram on each altar.
Okay, so what is Bilam saying this sacrifice now was for? For you, God,
For God.
right? He's because whatever Balak might be thinking, Bilam is now saying this is all for you, right? So again, we're like dancing, right? We're dancing back and forth with these ambiguities and allegiances. Let's pay attention to the name for God.
Right. And the Lord, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, put a word in Bilam's mouth.
Wait. What is number 4? Verse 4.
Oh, 4. God, Elohim.
Right. So there, so we just had the 4-letter name of God. That's Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and translated here, the Lord, with those funny kind of like mini capital letters, right? And then Elohim, they translate as God. So we go from Lord to God, and then we go to verse 5, and what do we have?
And the Lord, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh,
Right, we switch back again.
put a word in Bilam's mouth and said, return to Balak and speak thus. So he returned to him and found him standing beside his offerings and all the Moabite dignitaries with him.
Right, so we don't know what the thus is yet, right? This is one of the great pleasures of the storyteller, right? The storyteller is like chuckling, that he's keeping us at the edge of our seats. We're not going to get it for another, verse and a half, right? So, he's literally, this is the story, right? This is God's words. Bilam has nothing to do with it, right? And a little humor, and Balak is standing there on what? What does the verse say? Verse 6.
So he returned to him and found him standing beside his offerings.
Besides whose offerings?
I guess
I think Balak's.
Balak's, right? That the original.
So it's a vague pronoun, but Balak, a very fair reading is that Balak thinks these are his offerings. I mean, he paid for them, right?
No, it's yeah.
So they're definitely, that's the old joke, but again, he's oblivious to this whole dynamic of what's going on between Bilam and God, and how much God is involved here or not, right? He thinks everything at this point still is just going according to plan. He's got this very high-priced, magician prophet in his pocket. He's doing everything exactly the way, and to a certain extent, I would even say he's getting his money's worth. Because this is not some simple, the guy stands up there and then pronounces the curse and that's it. Look at how much pomp and circumstance there is to this. This is, people that work with a certain kind of clientele. They know they want that extra level of, fanciness and of elaborate, props and so on. It makes you feel like it's real. if it's just going to be simple, come on, right? So here is Balak standing there over his offerings. This is who v'chol sarei Moab, he and all of the court, right? They're all there. Okay.
He took up his theme and said, "From Aram has Balak brought me, Moab's king from the hills of the east. Come, curse me, Jacob. Come, tell Israel's doom. How can I damn whom God has not damned? How
Okay,
doom when the Lord has not doomed?"
Okay, so there we are. Now we got God mentioned twice in verse 8. So of course he's a very poetic,
Two different.
performer. So you can't just use the same name over and over and
No.
over again. So he has to vary the name. So you could see it just as a literary thing. But what are the two names that Bilam uses?
El
And then,
and Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh.
right. So he's got the El, Elohim is related to El. Elohim is just an expansion of El. El is single, a God, a power. Elohim is powers, almighty powers. And then Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, of course, is the unique name of God. So he puts both of them in there. And this is again where some of the scholars like Alter would say, El is a pretty common name. Other people use El also. El is not specifically Jewish, Israelite at this point, right? So Bilam can have it both ways. He says, Balak, if you believe in El, guess what? If El doesn't want to do this, we're not going to get away with this, right? If you believe as I do in Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, same thing, right? So there's a kind of a mushing together of both.
As I see them from the mountaintops, gaze on them from the heights, there is a people that dwells apart, not reckoned among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, number the dust cloud of Israel? May I die the death of the upright. May my fate be like theirs.
Okay. So the beginning of this poetic pronouncement is the intro. Right? It gives us the narrative background of how this things get set up. And then starting with verse 9, it becomes personal. Okay, I'm looking at them now, right? Here I am standing on this promontory and I see them. Of course, he doesn't say, I look at them from Bamot Baal. He doesn't, here I am on Bamot Baal, looking at them. No, he just says it in a very generic way. I'm standing on this craggy height. And then he says, and then he starts talking about Israel. Okay. What does he say about Israel? He says, this is a people who dwells apart. Hein am levadad yishkom, uvagoyim lo yitchashav. And among the nations, not reckoned, not counted, not considered important. Is this a blessing?
It's just a statement. It's not a blessing or a curse. This is who they are.
Look at verse 11.
Yeah.
Can you read that out loud? Verse 11.
Then Balak said to Bilam, "What have you done to me? Here I brought you to damn my enemies, and instead you have blessed them."
So Balak definitely thinks that what we just read is a blessing.
Well, that's the next
That could
part,
be
right?
10. That could be verse 10, not necessarily verse 9.
So is verse 9 a curse?
No, but
Is verse 9 a negative?
no, but it's not a negative. It's not a positive. It's just is.
A contrast, like even though we don't reckon these guys as important, and in reality, who has numbered the dust of Jacob, who can count his issue.
Right. So okay, so 10 is, wow, look at how many there are. There's so many of them, and they're really, righteous and good, Yesharim. I want to be in that. I want to be in that number, right? So That's the whole list. So the last part is unambiguous. But I want to come back to that first, to verse 9. Is there any people anywhere that would say on their national website, we are a totally insignificant people, and we have no relations with any other people in the world? Is that a national vision or agenda for
No.
any group anywhere? Maybe at one point, Japan had that idea, right? They were like 200 years of saying, we don't want anybody to pay attention to us. We don't want to know anybody else. We're closing in and we can't stand the rest of the world. And we're just going to stay, secluded. And then, of course, that period ended and things opened up. But so that's why I want to bring it up. How do we actually process that statement? The Torah says all the way at the beginning, it's not good for a person to be alone. Is it good for a nation to be alone? If the Jewish people, the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are foretold all the way at the beginning that you will be the father of many nations, right? That's what God says to Abraham. And this is, of course, the shadow hovering over this story. And God says, I've mentioned it many, many times in the discussions for this Torah portion. And he says, anyone who blesses you will be blessed. Anyone who curses you will be cursed. You will be a source of blessing for the nations of the world. Kol amei haaretz, v'nivrechu v'cha kol amei haaretz. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. So our initial charge, our initial foundation is that we're supposed to be having some kind of really global influence on the world. We're supposed to be having an impact on the world. So to me, this is a very startling way to start out.
But isn't it, well, one, it sets up this contrastive relationship with then what he says in 10. But the other thing is that he's been called on to curse these people because Balak feels threatened. So in fact, Balak isn't looking at them as some insignificant thing. He's looking at Israel as a potential threat, right? And so Bilam is kind of setting the stage that these people are apart, not bothering anybody. Nobody has really noticing them. And don't we all want to be like them? I mean, so.
Well, he wants to be like that.
He wants to be like that, right? But I mean, what he's so the end of 9 to me doesn't seem like a blessing or a curse, but it does contradict the whole premise of why he's been brought there.
Well, so let's again, Balak definitely is paying attention to this people, right? The word that I want to throw out there, a very fashionable word these days, when we say that they're not reckoned among the peoples, they're considered other, right? They're considered other. Marty, what do you want to say?
Could it be possible that when it talks about a people that shall dwell alone, that it means that these are the people who shall be, quote unquote, a light unto nations?
So that's an interesting question. In order to be
That's
a light
how I
unto
read it.
in order to be a light unto the nations, is the best way to do that to isolate yourself, or is the best way to do that to interact with everybody? One of the in modern times, one of the important claims of Jews that wanted to say, hey, here we are, we're finally accepted among all the nations, we're finally included, as full participants in world society. So, of course, many traditionalists said, oh no, this is terrible, this is going to destroy the Jewish people, we're going to all assimilate. But what the counter argument was, no, now we're finally going to be able to be a light to the nations. Now we'll finally be able to be a good influence and we'll be able to participate and make our contribution to the world. So this is one of the struggles that we have been going through in one way or another throughout our history, but it's been definitely exacerbated in modern times. What I'm trying to suggest is that possibly what Bilam is saying is nobody gets them. In other words, it goes into verse 10 by saying, other people don't see what I see. I'm looking at them and I know something about them. These people, the word that's the positive word instead of alone would be unique, right? They're alone because at this point in time, at Bilam's moment, there aren't, there's no coalition of monotheistic nations. There's no, great Abrahamic faiths, conventions. There's just this one group that have this strange, going back to this whole business about what God are they serving? What kind of God is that? So in that sense, they're very alien, they're very alone, and they're very different. They're not included as one of the standard nations in the ancient world. You had your own national pride and you were willing to kill other people who weren't part of your nation, if you had to, go to battle for certain things. But nevertheless, on a religious level, you've got, Baal this, and I've got El this, and you've got Chemosh, and I've got Osiris, and you've got, there was a kind of a easy sense of the form of religion might have different names for their gods in one place or another, but it basically ended up to be the same kind of thing. And then you've got this people who are talking another language, and they're not part of the club. They're not part of the club.
Rabbi, I read this as a very positive thing. I mean, what Sarita read, number 9, lo, it is a people that shall dwell alone. Now, it also has an unfortunate side effect. Dwelling alone is, not such a good thing.
Right.
But,
Nobody likes the stranger. Nobody likes the other. Nobody trusts the other. So this is part of the the burden that Jewish people have carried throughout time. How different can we be without getting clobbered? Right? How much otherness can the world take before the world decides to punish others for being other? It's a very tricky thing. That's why I say this is a very ambiguous verse. We have like only a minute or so left. I would say in a certain sense, this is part of where, if we continued, we would see it at the end. Where does God stop and where does Bilam come back in? The question of prophecy. So a prophet is supposed to be God's mouthpiece, but every prophet is still who they are. Isaiah is not Jeremiah. Jeremiah is not Ezekiel. Ezekiel is not Jonah or Elijah. Every one of the prophets filters God through their own personal being. So, and Bilam is definitely a strong personality. He overcomes that initial opposition by God. He gets God to let him, hang himself, so to speak, or he gives him a little bit more wiggle room. So this may be, I would say, possibly a way of looking at this verse. This is this kind of like transition point where Bilam is still talking personal before he gets into the full swing of then just putting out the praises of Israel. Right? He's still expressing some of his own ambivalence, his own hesitancy, right? As he looks at them. Yeah. All right, we're going to stop here. And we didn't answer any questions, but that's the whole idea, right?
Right.
So,
We
Yasher
asked a
Koach,
lot of
everybody.
questions.
Thank you very much.